A lot to say about Libya. It's been on my mind a great deal, and it's a very funny situation for me. I don't know if I can actually bring myself to say that the United States should do something military, but I can say this to you. In my first book, which was written when I was much younger, and if I rewrote it, I think I would make it a little more nuanced, perhaps. But I wouldn't change most of it, and I certainly wouldn't change this part. I wrote a section called The New White Man's Burden about humanitarian interventionism. And my point was this, a very simple one. In the cases when it would actually be humanitarian, the United States doesn't intervene.
When it would be?
When it would be actually purely humanitarian, that is when the United States does not intervene. And that is precisely what you are seeing here. This is, first of all, Gaddafi is a really easy target. The country's a big desert, and he's sending tanks 500 miles across the desert. I mean, this is made for the U.S. way of war. It would be, it's literally like a kid playing a video game, all right, taking this out. Secondly, it's Gaddafi, who, if you remember, some of you may remember the 80s. He was the single most demonized head of state in the entire world by the United States, including, I think, Khomeini, all right? We attacked him in 1986, didn't actually accomplish anything, didn't actually help anybody, but we did it. So this guy who's phenomenally demonized, who is generally thought to be, several bats short of a belfry, and here it is something that is, it's hard to tell what exactly these Libyan rebels are, but this much is clear. They're inspired by Tunisia and Egypt. They started off as an attempt at a peaceful uprising until, what can you do when you get attacked repeatedly? You can either die or you can fight back. And it was the most hopeful thing that has happened in Libya since anyone can remember. Every day that it turned into a war between the rebels and Gaddafi's forces, things got worse. That is what happens. If you look at the history of armed insurgencies, this is what happens. If you fight long enough, it doesn't matter what cause you started fighting for. It all disappears and washes away in violence and in the horrible things that you have to do in order to continue fighting an insurgency. For example, you have to kill everybody that you think might betray you. Not just people who have betrayed you, but those you think. And there are a lot of horrible things that happen when you get into an armed insurgency. And so every day it got closer to turning into that, the more hope was lost for any reasonable resolution. And yet you have, look at the American response. My God, I mean, just today, there's an article that says if they want to impose a no-fly zone, they couldn't get ships in place until April. I mean, the Fifth Fleet is in Bahrain, the Sixth Fleet's in the Mediterranean. The United States has 12 carrier battle groups around the world, and it's known about this thing for a month. This is a joke. This is pathetic. Or another one, they're not pushing it through NATO because of Germany's resistance. Germany. If my history serves me correctly, we once actually fought a war to determine how much say Germany gets in foreign policy, and yet. Yes, that's the one. So, there are all these ridiculous excuses being made, absolutely absurd, simply because they are afraid of what happens if the status quo is upended. Bahrain is even worse. How can you claim that this particular kleptocratic gangster family that has ruled Bahrain has more right and more legitimacy than the 70% of the population that are Shia? The Bahrain protests are like nothing I've ever heard of in world history. 200,000 people occupying Pearl Square, and obviously not all fitting in it, and all around, out of a citizen population of 500,000. Tell me anyone who's ever heard of anything like that before. And what happens? The United States makes some noises about reform and moderation, but it makes it clear it's completely on the side of the emir. It doesn't raise a peep when Saudi Arabia and the Emirates go in. There's now an occupation force of Wahhabis to put down a Shia uprising. And nobody is thinking about even whether does this make any sense, let alone whether is this moral to somehow subvert the first attempt by the people to actually assert their sovereignty. So I'm so beyond disgusted with what the Obama administration has been doing that, frankly, I think it might be better if Bush was in charge right now. It's that bad. Why not have the Egyptian military intervene in Libya instead, especially since having a force on the ground increases the chance of success?
No, it is necessary for success.
Well, there is already a force on the ground, and it's the Libyan rebels. So let me tell you what would be, from the point of view of the Libyan rebels, the ideal thing, which is that the United States doesn't allow Libya to fly its air force and doesn't allow Gaddafi to send his tanks against them. That would be very easy. That's different from completely defeating Gaddafi. If that were to happen, well, first of all, it would send a very clear signal. Already, the reason there is a rebel force is that many military commanders defected and are opposed to Gaddafi, all right? The reason that they are so poorly equipped is that Gaddafi did not give any equipment to his regular army. This is one of the things that tyrants often do. Saddam, for example, did not allow his army into Baghdad, period. Only the Republican Guard, Special Republican Guard, etc., were allowed in the city. Similarly, in Libya, Gaddafi has an elite force that actually has the equipment that was not the regular military. So the question is, if the U.S. sends a signal like this, will other military figures defect from Gaddafi to the rebel? At one point, Gaddafi was losing any shred of legitimacy he had. He was bringing in foreign mercenaries to randomly shoot his own people. If you are at that point, you have lost any claim to legitimacy in a country. And that was very clear. I mean, you could see there are articles of a 14-year-old girl in a high school in Tripoli talking about how she's not afraid of Gaddafi and how Libyan state TV is full of nonsense, talking to a Western reporter about it. I mean, there's a whole generation of revolutionaries being created just by what Gaddafi is doing right now. Okay, so that is a possibility. If the U.S. were to intervene that way, it is possible the rebels could win. The reason I don't come out and advocate it is because I know the United States doesn't do things out of some disinterested moral sense. They do them because, in this case, they'll do it only because they feel forced to, because they'll get a bad reputation. With regard to Egypt, well, the Egyptian revolution is still ongoing. One of the most heartening things about Tunisia and Egypt is they didn't stop with the overthrow of the dictator. They kept going. They are moving forward, trying to democratize the society. The military is pushing back, all right? The military is still torturing people in Egypt. It hasn't stopped. And people are fighting, and people are actually, they're in all kinds of ways. They're resisting, they're in dialogue. It's a real, active, ongoing political process, but it is a long way from the people being able to dictate something like an invasion of Libya. Also, invasions like that are generally a bad idea. Once you have a foreign force on the ground for any length of time, they always commit abuses, and they always create legitimate feelings of resistance against the occupying force. I think Americans may actually have some experience from the other side of the problems of being an occupying force. So I actually would be very much against that. My generation, the way we got involved in thinking about politics, it was the first generation that grew up with the fear of nuclear holocaust as the primary issue. Now, many of you also grew up with the fear of nuclear holocaust, but somehow there were other things, and it never became a defining issue of a generation until, I think, my generation. The first important book I read about current events and current politics was Jonathan Schell's Fate of the Earth. My ex-wife is from Turkey. She's 2 years younger than me. We read the same things. We were thinking about the same issues as 7,000 miles away. And so there is this, anything to do with nuclear power, nuclear energy, nuclear bombs, it sort of resonates immediately with me. And in particular, it's really striking to think about in the Fukushima Daiichi reactor, the 50 people who stayed behind. The 50 people who are trying to put out the fires right now so that there isn't a full meltdown, in inadequate radiation suits, trying to minimize the time running in and out and going in shifts, but committed to be there. And think about who those people are. When something real and something important has to be done for the benefit of other people, who gets called? It's not corporate CEOs, it's not bloviating politicians, it's not entrepreneurs or venture capitalists or Bill Gates or philanthrocapitalists or the editors of Forbes. Who is it? It's working people. They get constructed as the enemy of society, and if the enemy of society is good, but whenever anything real has to be done, there's nobody else to do it. And those 50 people are, you know, in the same reviled classes as many of the people being fought here, and they are risking their lives against an invisible enemy for the good of other people.